Good week. We are now in week 14 of the class, and look forward to talking to you. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. This is actually the second recording I've made of this video because my daughter erased the first video that I made last night, so that was none too happy with her. And I'd also thrown out my notes that I'd used to make the recording, so I'm going a bit on memory, but I do want to address some of the key points that you guys had made in your posts this week, and there were some really good posts. And the first post is the question of, what is virtue ethicists? How would they respond to the central course question? And of course, as we know, the central course question is how much time and energy should I spend on myself versus others? And you correctly identified, I think all of the posts that I read, balance as the key principle that a virtue ethicist would use in determining what to do. This idea of balance, this idea of moderation, this idea of splitting time between yourself and others, roughly 50-50, as a general statement, virtue ethicists would agree with. But then you go further and you ask, well, what does that really mean? Does that mean every single day 50% of my time should be spent on myself and 50% on others? Or something else? And I think a virtue ethicist would answer something else. So there could be periods of your life where you are more focused on you, and there could be periods of life where you are more focused on others. College is a great example. College is a time that you're at right now, really where you're meant to explore yourself, figure out who you are, figure out what you're really good at, figure out what you're really passionate about, and develop those skills and those talents and that passion into a career that one hopes will benefit society as a whole. After you get out of college, certainly once you become a parent, the balance of time could be more devoted to others, and so it could shift. But at no time would you be totally devoted to yourself or totally devoted to others. There is always that sense of moderation. And so even in a period where you are more focused on yourself, again, not completely focused on yourself, but more focused on yourself, you've got to consider others as well. And there could be moments within that time that call for you to really shift the focus for a brief period. Your boyfriend or your girlfriend gets really sick. Your dad or mom loses their job, and you got to help out with the family more. Stuff like that could call you within this broader context, broader period when you're devoted to others, back towards yourself or vice versa, to others more than yourself. So, that's certainly something to add there. In terms of Thanksgiving, so it sounded like many of you had wonderful Thanksgiving discussions. On the whole, it seemed like most people thought that Thanksgiving was not an immoral holiday, and there was a couple different arguments for why that is the case. One set of arguments essentially said, look, there's all these other elements that are associated with Thanksgiving. Gratitude, family, bonding, sharing, so on and so forth. And many of you said, look, those are good, virtuous things and characteristics, and that's why Thanksgiving is moral. But you got to be careful here, because it's a real question as to whether you're essentially, by saying that, are you essentially saying that, look, Thanksgiving is moral in this regard, but ignore the gluttony or the excess or the waste? And so you might say it's moral in this regard, but immoral in another regard. And that's certainly something worth considering. Another thing to consider in this kind of frame of mind is, well, if it is good to get family together and to share and to be generous and to spend quality time with each other, is it necessary to have the excess associated with Thanksgiving, the abundance associated with it? Something to consider. Others said, look, essentially, the holiday is about generosity. It is about thanks. And it not only calls together families, but it calls forth a greater sense of generosity as a whole. More people are willing to give and to be thankful. Some people argue that essentially, look, Thanksgiving may promote gluttony and excess, but it's really about the individual. You as an individual, and each individual has to make their choice as to whether they're going to kind of give in to this gluttony and abundance or not. But if you go that route, certainly it is worth asking whether, yes, it's still the individual's responsibility, but do we have to critique certain values that are associated with it? Does Thanksgiving promote excess and waste? Is it a coincidence that Black Friday follows immediately after Thanksgiving? There was another post, I think it was by Paige Manning's grandmother, who said, I work my butt off on Thanksgiving, so it's not about being lazy or about being wasteful. Actually it's about, really putting forth a lot of effort. So those are the ways that you can go with regard to that discussion post. When I asked, what virtues would you identify as coming up with your own, name some characteristics that could be a midpoint between excess and deficiency. Again, there was a number of really interesting posts, and I'll just highlight a few. One person put, confidence is the midpoint between arrogance and a lack of confidence, a deep insecurity, and I think that's true, absolutely. And what's interesting about this post is that the author talked about arrogance being superior, where you would look down upon others. And I think that's certainly true, but another element of that post is that if you are arrogant, you also rely completely on yourself, and so it doesn't allow you to be open to others. It doesn't allow you to be present to the situations at hand. And one could argue that that's wrong, not only because it's an excess, but because it would violate that central course question where you're only really about you. You're in your own little world. In the same vein, somebody named flexibility as the midpoint between being going with the wind, being overly flexible, and completely malleable, and the lack, which would be inflexible. Again, you could relate to the central course question and essentially say, well, flexibility is a good thing. It allows you to be attentive to the concerns and needs of others and to change. But by being inflexible, you're so wedded and tied to a particular way of doing things and seeing things that you can never be open to anyone and their needs and their intentions, so on and so forth. And on the other hand, if you're completely malleable, you can never transcend. You can never go beyond the immediate demands of the situation and stand by a principle or stand by good, so on and so forth. In both of these cases, the virtue ethicist would be someone who's really aware of context. And this is something that's really important to notice, that context matters. It matters big time for a virtue ethicist. You've got to think about what you're doing, to whom you're doing it, in what way you're doing it, in what time you're doing it, to what degree you're doing it, so on and so forth. And that's why a virtue ethicist says, look, develop all these virtues such that when you're in the situation where you need to be patient, you can be patient. When you're in the situation to be bold, you can be bold, so on and so forth. And so that is in essence some of the ideas that you put forth, and I'll wrap up this recap with that thought.